Okay, boys and girls, it's trivia time. Can you answer the question, why did God not allow Moses to go into the promised land? It's a very good question. After all Moses did in honor of God and faithfulness to God, and all he put up with, to risk his life, to have to put up with 40 years of wandering in the wilderness with some grumpy folks, and everything he endured, in the end, he was not allowed to enter into the promised land despite how faithful he was. So the question is, why not? What did he do? Well, before we answer that question, let's talk about the act that actually happened. In Exodus chapter 17, at one point when the Hebrews were wandering in the wilderness, they needed water. So there was a rock that accompanied them, and Moses was instructed by God to take his staff and strike the rock once, and water would come out. And he did. Water came out, the people drank, they survived. It was good. As time went on, there was so much stress on Moses. There's all sorts of information about that you can read in there. When we get to Numbers, I believe it's chapter 20, there comes a time when Moses is frustrated with everybody. They're thirsty again, and God tells Moses, speak to the rock and water will come out. But Moses is frustrated, and he rips on the people of the congregation, and he gives them a piece of his mind, and then he strikes the rock again, and water comes out. So he loses his temper, and because of that, God says, you can't go to the promised land. What's up with that? Everybody loses their temper. That's not fair. Why is it that Moses, one of the most faithful, I would argue the second most important patriarch in our faith, is not allowed to go to the promised land because he lost his temper? Well, there's an explanation, and it has to do with this. Again, as a mathematician and statistician, when I go back into the Old Testament and I look at how careful and precise God is with his signs and prophecies, even verb tenses that clearly depict what his plan is to redeem humanity, it's really impressive. And God had actually set up another sign that was really important for the world to see and recognize that Jesus was the Messiah. He would have to be struck down once and killed, and he'd rise from the dead. And the Bible in Jeremiah chapter 17 and other places suggests that the Anointed One, the Messiah, will give us rivers of living water. It's talking about the Holy Spirit, that after Jesus is crucified and he's risen from the dead and his blood is sprinkled on the mercy seat, then no longer is the presence of God going to be confined to just the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, in the Jewish temple. God promises us that now, because of what he did for us, his Spirit will reside in us, that we are the temples of the Holy Spirit. So now we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and Paul's writing. And here's the explanation as to why Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land. They all talk about the people wandering in the desert. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. So in other words, God had a very clear sign that was supposed to happen. He told Moses the first time, strike the rock. The rock is Jesus. Water comes out. He gives us his Holy Spirit. The next time they needed water, God didn't say strike the rock because Jesus the Messiah is only supposed to be struck down once. He said speak to the rock and water will come forth. And really, that's basically describing for us in our dispensational period that what we get to do is we get to talk to God. We get to request his Holy Spirit to lead us and guide us, and we will receive that water. So he told Moses, speak to the rock. But Moses got angry and he struck the rock. So Moses blew it. God had to bring it to the attention of everybody. It seemed unfair at the time. Why would you penalize him for losing his temper? But it wasn't about him losing his temper. It was about him messing up on a very clear sign that happened in reality, in real life. There was another depiction of who Jesus is and what he would do. So in the end, Moses couldn't go because everybody had to see that he messed up the sign. The Messiah struck down once. After that, we speak to him, and he gives us rivers of living water. God's amazing, and it brings up another point, that sometimes we suffer. It seemed very unfair that Moses wasn't allowed to go in the promised land after all he did. But sometimes we have to sacrifice. Things have to be brought to our attention so that we can understand God's plan and His goodness for us. And that's a whole other topic that goes even further with pain and suffering.